But anyway, I'm really glad to be here with you. I'm humbled by the invitation that Scott gave me to come and share with you. I have spent 14 years as state director, with the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention and church planting and missions. I was 9 years state director of missions. Before that, I was with Tarrant Baptist Association, which is the Fort Worth area in Texas. So I've spent almost 20 years working with missionaries and church planters. I grew up on the mission field. My parents were missionaries in Chile for 35 years. My brother and sister-in-law were there for 20 years, although they just moved to London, where he's going to be human resources person for IMB for Eurasia and Africa and all that. And the only thing I'm mad at is he gets to travel to all the cool places. But missionaries and church planters are my heroes. So you're my heroes, and so I appreciate the opportunity to come and share a little bit of insight, hopefully, and knowledge. Probably most of what I'm going to tell you is nothing new. You know it. I just hope that I've been able to pull some of this together where there's a few aha moments. But so we are at the You Are Here conference, but I guess the question is, where is here? What is here like? Now, probably each one of you would answer that question differently, for you come from different heres and now minister in different heres. Besides, the question we're going to ask tonight is, how did we even get here? Now, I'm not trying to be cute about all that, but I'm simply saying that the theme for this conference is so important. It's always been critical to understand your ministry, understand your here, where you are in ministry, your context, your community, your people. You know that as pastors and as church planters, but perhaps it's never been so important as much as it is now, 16 years into the 21st century. See, at one time, Christianity, at least cultural Christianity, and we'll talk a bit more about that later, dominated Western culture. The Protestant version dominated American culture, primarily in the guise of what we'd call American civil religion. Now, some would argue that all this means that we were originally founded as a Christian nation. Others deny that claim. Whatever the case may have been, that cultural Christianity is gone. It's over. And we need to get over it and learn how to do ministry in a post-Christian, if not really an anti-Christian society. And again, many of you know that, you experience it, you're there day to day. Bottom line, things have changed. And they're changing more rapidly than anyone have thought of, especially those of us that are 40 or 50 and above. I mean, you know, some of the things I wrote in this book and in the previous book 3 years, they're already dated. I mean, it'd be just because none of us predicted how fast the gay marriage issue would move, and that the whole transgender thing would just explode like it has. It's changed rapidly, and it's changing even more and more quickly than any of us can imagine. So what to do? What do we do? What do we need to know? What do we need to do? And how do we need to do it? Now, I call this series of conferences, and I've kind of developed this as part of my ministry. I call it a new flight plan for the 21st century. And I've kind of tapped into that aviation flight metaphor, and it's because I like airplanes. I don't know how to fly, and I get airsick easily, but I like planes. And of course, there are different kinds of planes. You got big planes, small planes, wide body, passenger, cargo. You have the military planes. You have the bombers and the fighters and the stealth and the subsonic and the supersonic and the jet planes and the prop and so forth and so on. But there are some commonalities in all those planes. They're trying to move something through the air that's heavier than the air. You know, that principle of aerodynamics is that it is actually the wings that are flying and carrying the body, carrying the tube that you're sitting in. And if you got to have adequate speed or you're going to stall. Now, what scares passengers more than anything, and probably everybody in here has been a passenger, what usually disconcerting to passengers more than anything are storms, turbulence, even though generally speaking they're harmless and don't do anything. And that is what you're doing as you are piloting or pastoring your churches, your church plants. You're having to deal with cultural storms, unexpected storms. Some of these storms are just simply kind of irritating. Some of them are potentially devastating. But if you're not prepared to fly in the midst of the storms, if you do not prepare your congregation for those storms, if you're not willing and able to design a new flight plan to deal with or even avoid some of those storms, disaster could strike. So in this conference, I understand I've got 4 sessions, and I think that's up there. Yeah, we got it up there. Session 1, we're gonna look here first of all about who changed the map. And I'm just kind of a biblical reference here. This is the Pharaoh principle. In other words, things have changed. Somebody else is in charge. Things have changed. Now, the purpose of this first session is I want to set the stage by looking at how and why our context has changed. I'm going to give you an overview of some historical and a little philosophical background. And I know that's where some of you check out and go to sleep, and some of you get excited. Depends on how you did in high school and college. But we're going to look at a little bit of that history, a little bit of that philosophy, very brief, because I think it's very important. We need to know where we've been and what happened so that we know where we are right now. So the question we're going to ask in this first session is, what do we need to know? We're dealing with some knowledge and some information here. The second session, tomorrow, reading the new map. And there's that Issachar principle. You not only need to know what's happening, you need to know what to do about it. So we're going to understand current culture, understand current worldviews and how they affect your ministry. And again, the question we're going to try to answer in that session 2 is, what do we need to understand? Basically dealing there with a little bit of analysis, a little bit of preparation. Session 3, we're going to look at the Pauline principle. That at 1 Corinthians 9, trying to be all things to all people, going to do whatever it takes. And there the purpose is to look at some cultural exegesis and some engagement. Learning to think like a missionary, to do contextualization the proper way, the right way. So the question we're going to answer in session 3 is, what do I need to do? Again, we're going to look at some strategy, some practical engagement. And then the final session, the Peter principle. And we'll look at a few passages in 1 Peter chapter 2. And the purpose there is to remind you of the foundations of all that we have said up to that point. Yeah, it sounds a little bit backwards. You usually do the foundations first, but I think this will be a good way to close it out. And the question simply there is how do we do all this that we've talked about in these 3 previous sessions? We're going to deal with attitude, with some encouragement hopefully for you, and hopefully some inspiration. So session 1, who changed the map? The Pharaoh principle. You know the story. New king who did not know Joseph, and there were new times and things had changed for the people, the children of Israel. That's where we are. Things have changed. What happened? Well, let me share an illustration first. Again, one of these aviation flight illustrations. August 2nd, 1985 was a typical North Texas summer day. Hot and sunny. And en route from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to DFW was Delta Flight 191, a Lockheed L-1011. I don't even think they fly those anymore, with 167 passengers and crew on board. Now, as the plane approached DFW Airport, air traffic control gave them landing instructions that would bring them in from the north. Captain Connors saw that a thunderstorm was in his way, so he flew the plane around the thunderstorm before lining up to land. Now, while the plane was lining up to land, a huge updraft began to form, and a thunderstorm was forming with more energy than 100 nuclear power reactors. The problem with all this is that it was all disguised in the form of harmless, puffy white clouds, nothing to worry about at all, it seemed. As the plane approached 1,500 feet, the first officer noted that lightning was coming out of one of the clouds. As they got down to 800 feet, the plane behaved oddly. It began to speed up, though no one had touched the throttles. It went from landing speed of 149 knots up to 173 knots. The first officer who was flying the plane pulled back on the throttles. Captain Connors, however, recognized that odd behavior as the first signs of wind shear. We've heard a lot about wind shear, especially since that day. He warned the first officer to watch his speed or he would lose it all of a sudden. And he did. Captain yelled to push it up, but the plane's speed dropped from 173 to 133 knots. Speed rose again, and then suddenly dropped to 119 knots, which is pretty close to stall speed. Alarms began to sound and go off. Pilots were desperate, began yelling, and then the plane crashed. It landed hard in a field, bounced right onto Highway 114, crushing a car, destroyed engine number 1. And the loss of that engine number 1 caused the plane to veer left, hit 2 4-million-gallon water tanks, finally hitting the ground at 220 knots, and 136 of 167 on board died. Now, that threat of severe weather means pilots have to be ready to read the map and adjust their flight plan. They're always aware of storms that may be ahead, what's going on around them while they're airborne. They know what may be dangerous, they know what can be ignored, and they know what may just simply be an inconvenience. Whatever the case, pilots have in mind accomplishing the mission, which is getting you and me to our destination safely. They learn to read their maps, navigate the storms in order to get the job done. The cultural map has changed. Our churches face multiple cultural storms. And these storms can be unexpected, they can be panic-inducing, and they can be devastating, but they don't have to be if you learn to read the map correctly, and if you draw up a flight plan, a new flight plan to missionally deal with, but perhaps not eliminate, the storms. The problem for so many of us, especially for those of us who have been in ministry for several decades, and you know who you are because you're like me, you're gray-headed or no hair, gray hair, or as Pastor told me not too long ago, he knew he was in trouble when he got to his new church and stood up, and they were all blue hairs, gray hairs, and no hairs. And I took offense because I'm two of those three, but that's a whole other story. But you know, if we've been in ministry for the last 30, 40 years, you've been around for several decades, the problem is that we were taught to fly, so to speak, through ministry based on a Christianized culture map. We drew the map. Shoot, in fact, we owned the map. But all of a sudden, the map's changed. Culture is no longer Christian, if it ever really was biblically Christian. The culture is no longer accommodating to the church and is in fact mostly adamantly opposed to the church, to her message, to her mission. Well, what happened to the map? What changed it? Well, again, here we go, a little bit of historical context. We'll talk first about Christendom and the American experiment. Now, reach back into your church history if you took that, the rise of Christendom. If you'll remember, the first 3 centuries of the Christian church were one of a minority status, one of intermittent and sometimes very difficult persecution. The early church, however, had shown that in the midst of tribulation, she could not only survive, but she could thrive. The gospel, Christian commitment was first tested and proven to be victorious in the fires of persecution. We know that about the first 3 centuries. We preach about that as we preach through Acts or as we preach 1 Peter. But the question was, what would happen when the church moved from the margins of that society to the center of the society, the center of power? Well, in AD 312, Emperor Constantine needed to politically unify the empire. And so in AD 313, he declared Christianity to be the favored religion. Now, there's all kind of historians debate, was he really converted into Christian, or was this just purely a political move? And historians are all over the spectrum on that. But the fact is that he said, I need to unify the empire, so Christians, you are now the favored religion. The kingdom on earth at last. Here we are, Great Commission fulfilled, everybody's a Christian, the kingdom on earth at last. But as Coach Lee Corso on ESPN's Saturday Game Day says, not so fast, my friend. The favored status was beneficial for Christians in some ways. Eventually, the prevailing culture was slowly but surely transformed into a, quote, Christian culture. To such a degree that, as one historian stated it, Christianity became identified with Greco-Roman civilization. The problem was that the marriage of church and culture corrupted both the church and culture, church and state. Happens every time. Well, there were some negatives. Pagans joined the church under pressure. You join or else, right? Or for pragmatic reasons. Not that anybody would ever join church for pragmatic reasons, but they did in those days. Well, the emperor interfered with church business. And you remember that from some of your studies about the councils. The bishops would argue and fight, and the emperor said, you're going to get this settled or else. We'd never see the government interfere, but they did in those days. Ultimately, all those born into the empire, into that Holy Roman Empire, were considered Christians. You're born into the empire, you're a Christian. Corruption followed, and the Great Commission mandate suffered. If everybody born here is a Christian, Why do you need the Great Commission? Many thought that the Great Commission, even many theologians, church fathers, thought the Great Commission had been fulfilled. Well, what about those outside the empire? Well, forget the Great Commission. If they're enemies, and eventually that was mostly Muslims, we're just going to kill them. And if they're in the New World many centuries later, we're just going to forcibly convert them. And you know that history. But if you're born in the empire, you're a Christian. So Christendom then, what is Christendom? It's the alignment of Christianity in the state, the alignment of Christianity in the culture. And the church relied on political power to maintain doctrinal purity. The popes, the bishops, the leaders, in cahoots with the emperors and the kings and the princes. We'll take care of each other. So the church relied on the politicians to maintain doctrinal purity, to combat heretics, and there were plenty of those, to enforce sanctions on the Christian population. Well, the state, on the other hand, I'll scratch my back, your back, you scratch my back. The state relied on the church to give divine legitimacy and credence to their power and their decisions. Hey, they were born into it, God ordained. So Christendom and territory were identified with each other. To be a citizen of the realm was to be a Christian. To be outside of the realm was simply to be a heretic or a pagan. This was a status quo for centuries. There were times of tension, of course. There was times of disagreement between church and state, between popes and princes, but the centers were essentially held in check. It was often an uncomfortable marriage, but it was an effective marriage. Well, Christendom was checked and in decline. Protestant Reformation significantly changed the nature of the marriage, but the marriage continued both politically and culturally. Basically, many European nations just shifted from the Roman Catholic culture to the Anglican or the Lutheran culture, but it was still a marriage of culture and culture and church. The subsequent Enlightenment, remember your philosophy. In come the Enlightenment philosophers, and they highlighted human autonomy. They highlighted human liberty. Not so much interested in revelation anymore. We're going to discover truth. There is absolute truth, but it's going to be discovered apart from revelation and all those superstitions. It's going to be discovered through human reason, and it's going to be discovered through the empiricists, through human observation and experience, because human beings have innate goodness, and there's going to be inevitable human progress. All those religious superstitions were going to be rejected. That's stuff for the church. Now, that was the tension. That's what the Enlightenment brought in. So modernity then, we entered to modernity, and again, don't think here in terms of technological modernity, though that's part of it. Think in terms of the philosophical modernity. And modernity is simply life defined and fueled by those Enlightenment ideals. Well, modernity took hold of the Western world. Christianity was deemed more and more unreasonable, more and more irrelevant. The Bible was a good book, and Jesus was a good man. And we could probably get the best possible ethics and morals by observing Him and reading Scripture, but forget all that supernatural stuff. Forget that atonement, resurrection, virgin birth stuff. That's unreasonable. Bible was a superstitious text seen by many of these. Church was corrupt and irrelevant. In many cases it was. Christianity was merely the source for good ethical and moral behavior. Science, technology, and again, whether rationalism or empiricism became the ultimate sources of authority. Modernity, however, failed to deliver the desired ultimate results, and so we got postmodernism or postmodernity. Postmoderns look at the 20th century and say, well, how did that work out for you and all your Enlightenment modern ideals? 2 world wars that devastated the world, nuclear bombs exploding, ecological disaster, and we don't think that autonomous human reason is all that great after all. So see, modernity believed in and sought absolute truth through human efforts. The truth is not revealed, says the modern. It's out there somewhere. And we discover it through our reason, through our observation, because we're innately good and we will always progress. You got all the Darwinism and evolution, all that in there, that inevitable progress. That's the modern mind. Well, the postmodern looks at the mess that led to in the 20th century and rejects the notion of absolute truth. Oh, you people want to be absolute about everything. Look where it got you. So relativism and pluralism reign. Experience and context, personal experience and community context are ultimate authorities. Christianity for the postmodern is just one more option among a myriad of spiritualities. Now, modernity is not dead by any means, but it is fighting for its life. So Christendom has collapsed, even in traditional Roman Catholic countries. Church buildings are empty. They're just like museums. Attendance in most European nations is in single-digit percentages. The church has been culturally marginalized, displaced, relocated to the margins. Christendom as a formal church-state relationship, Christendom as the determiner of Western culture is dead. It's just that the body hasn't been buried yet. The map has changed. Now, some reflections, some lessons, some consequences of Christendom. We look back and we think, man, you're talking about 2,000 years almost of history. Are there any positives that came out of that? As you look back on it historically, yeah, there are some positives. One is that near identification of Western culture and Christianity provided a foundation for common societal mores. I mean, there was a common morality at least taught and spoken of. And from those common societal mores, we got the morality and the patriotism and the politics and education, the arts. That's Western civilization. It's not to knock all that. That's a positive that came out of it. Number two is that because there was that common morality, we got the founding of schools and universities, hospitals, other benevolent ministries. The secularists just look back and says religion's all bad. They don't know their history. Christian religion brought many good things to human life. They just did. Number three, it also meant, that unity of church and state. It meant unity in fighting pagans, even engaging in war with another Christendom nation. They fought each other, you know that. The king was able to represent God, and God was always on our side, whichever side you were on. Of course, that made life easier for nobles and royals and the church hierarchy. What about the negatives? What about the negatives? And this is what eventually brought Christendom down. Number one is Christendom could only be held together by power. Alluded to that already. Dissenters had to be silenced. And Wycliffe and Huss and others. Heretics had to be disposed of, usually burned at the stake. Rebels stopped, and pagans forcibly converted, which is what happened to the discovery of the New World in Africa and in Latin America. Convert or else. The cross and the sword. Number two, a negative, is because Europe was Christian, as we already mentioned, it was generally argued that the Great Commission had been fulfilled. All Christendom had to do then was to defend itself against pagans, Islam, after 600 AD, forcibly convert them, the New World. So until the modern missionary movement of the late 18th century, the Great Commission, with a few notable exceptions, was mostly ignored. And then finally, such corruption and abuse of power simply meant that the gospel and the prevailing culture had become so syncretized, they had become so convoluted and mixed up together as to be unrecognizable. The Bible was used to justify every political and economic agenda, including colonization and slavery. Jesus, therefore, was not the Lamb of God. He was not the suffering servant in Christendom. He was the conquering king, but the conquering king for the status quo. Well, what's the current reality? What's the status of Christendom today? Well, the church has moved from the center to the margins. That's a fact in Western Europe. It's a fact in Canada. And it's more and more so in the U.S. Now, I'll state this in a minute. But paradoxically, the non-Western world, and many of you know this, the non-Western world, you've experienced it, they still see the West, and America in particular, as a Christian culture, and all Westerners as Christians. The missionary who gets in the cab in a Middle Eastern country. Oh, you're an American. Yes, I am. Oh, then you're a Christian. Well, you happen to be. Yes, I am. Oh, I have Christian music. And so he pops in a Michael Jackson CD, Now, or the lady that I know that I've worked with in the past who's a Jordanian Palestinian converted from Islam, and she tells a story of her father was adamantly opposed to her moving to the United States because I'm afraid you'll become like one of those Christian women like Madonna. That's the way they see us because they think we're a Christian nation, and many of us are insistent on proclaiming we're a Christian nation, and look what they see. Well, we do the same thing to them. All Muslims are terrorists, right? We all lump and dump a little bit. Well, the identification of the gospel with Western culture, with Western ways, has backfired. Our syncretism confuses non-Westerners and makes missions more difficult. Now, the good news is that the death of Christendom means the rise, the rediscovery of biblical evangelism and missions. Christendom did quite well in producing nominal Christians, but it's hopeless when it comes to biblical evangelism and discipleship. That's the good news. It's kind of like some say, well, the church attendance is declining, Christianity is dying out. No, cultural Christians are finally getting honest and are saying, I don't need this. But if you're a committed Christian, you're sticking with it. Well, here's the important thing to hear and to remember. The collapse of Christendom does not mean that Christianity has collapsed. Two different things. Cultural Christianity, Christendom, has collapsed in the Western world. And the majority of Christianity has shifted to the global South. The future really is global. Well, what about in the United States, the American experiment? What about us? Well, some Protestant beginnings. Now, Christendom first came, and you know this better in New Mexico than the rest of the country does. The Christendom first came with the Spanish explorers in the southwest part of the United States. You got evidence of that everywhere. Well, the British brought Christendom with that Church of England flavor to the colonies. And we all know well the story of pilgrims, Puritans, dissenters came to the colonies for religious freedom. Now, most of them conceived of themselves as God's chosen people and were determined to establish, true Christian communities. Although, unfortunately, we know through our history there were a lot of mixed results. Most of them failed, and they weren't always thoroughly biblical. But there was a general Judeo-Christian morality in society. But there was also genocide of the Native American, slavery, too often imposing the will of the United States on other nations. And I grew up in Latin America, so I'm well aware of that piece of our history of, sometimes very covertly imposing our will on other countries. The reality is that our American Puritan heritage should not be downplayed and ignored, and secularists try to do that. Well, it's not important or it didn't really happen. But that Puritan heritage also should not be made the sole determiner of American identity. I would argue that America is the result of the threefold convergence of the Judeo-Christian worldview. Yes, there were some biblical foundations, but there was also that pursuit of financial freedom and material wealth. Many people came here to make a buck. That's why they had all those plantations and slaves in the South. And it convergence of those Enlightenment modern philosophies grew out of the Enlightenment. And that included some religious freedom. But that's why when we look at our founding fathers, we see that they were a religious bunch, but not always necessarily committed Orthodox Christians. They were religious and sometimes Judeo-Christian in the broadest ethical sense, but they didn't all hold to what we would consider orthodox doctrines. These nominal Christian men those who were nominal Christian were mostly children of the Enlightenment. They were thoroughly part of the Enlightenment, rationalist or empiricist. For many of our founding fathers, religion was that of deism, or as many would argue, Christianity, a reasonable Christianity, a Christianity reduced to its most basic and reasonable elements. So there is a result of the marriage of our Puritan heritage, Enlightenment deism. We get the public religion of America, the civil religion of America. And it's grounded in Enlightenment principles, but it's informed by biblical themes. God, in this American civil religion was nature's God. Read the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and you'll see they talk about nature's God. Think about that a little bit. He was known through reason. He was known through nature rather than revelation. Jesus, therefore, is a man who showed us how to live a good and moral life. The bottom line in all of this to remember is that because you see someone of that era quoting the Bible or talking about God, that does not mean that they were an orthodox believer. So, I'd say you know that. Somebody scores a touchdown and they thank God for it. They win a Grammy and praise Jesus. Does that mean they're an orthodox believer? Well, same thing applies. Just because you quote Scripture or refer to God does not make you a Christian. So was the U.S. founded as a Christian nation? Was it founded to be a Christian nation? Well, again, there's that spectrum. For some would argue that any mention of God, any mention of the Bible, that's evidence in favor of the fact that we were founded to be a Christian nation, as a Christian nation. At the other end are the secularists who pay no attention to the influence of religion, but the truth is somewhere in the middle. We were founded on a Judeo-Christian ethic. We appropriated some biblical principles, but it was in a Christendom environment with all of those assumptions. So we were religious, not necessarily a Christian nation, but definitely certainly a religious nation. You got to remember, in those days, everybody was a Christian, supposedly. So the development of civil religion, that public religion, that's what many Americans yearn for. I hear all the time, I see it on Facebook, people always say, well, we just got to get back to the way we were. We need to go back, and they talk a lot about going back. And what they're missing is that comfort of American civil religion. That public set of beliefs, of symbols and rituals, they may be biblically informed, but not necessarily biblically Christian. For many of them, it's the idea that America is God's chosen nation. You ever heard that? We're God's chosen nation, and if America fails, it's the end of the world. There's only one nation chosen by God, and it's not us. But that's ingrained in our public religion. We miss that common religious consensus. We miss those generic prayers at public events. If we just got prayer back in schools and back at the football games and all that, we'd have revival, right? Well, maybe not. What about the American flag on display in churches? You see the syncretism that begins to take place right there. But that's what people miss. We want to get back to that. In God we trust. We're going to fight over that, even though that didn't come about till the early 50s. Swearing in on the Bible. Who swears in on the Bible? Everybody. You swear on the Bible when you get called to court. Doesn't matter if you're an atheist. You swear on the Bible. Is that right, wrong? Is it bad, good? Or is it a different... But my point is, it's kind of a generally accepted religious thing to do that doesn't reflect who we are. God is on our side in all wars. You knew that, didn't you? Well, it's debatable how beneficial to our nation those practices are. They may not be reflective of biblical Christianity, and they may confuse more than anything. They confuse those of us who are, Americans for generations. Think how confusing it is for people who are coming here. Well, civil religion begins to fade. There's a growing cultural religious pluralism. You know that. New Mexico, 45 people groups. Now, not all of them immigrant groups, but, hundreds and hundreds of people groups in the United States. So, even though our civil religion started kind of that Protestant version, what happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century? Immigration, huge immigration from Ireland, Poland, Italy, Eastern Europe. What were they? Roman Catholics. Now, you were already Roman Catholic here because of the Hispanic influence, but Roman Catholics. So all of a sudden, we went from being a Protestant civil religion to a Judeo-Christian civil religion because also Jews were more accepted. Well, what happened in 1965? Immigration quotas were lifted by the Johnson administration. And what have we been flooded with the last 50 years? People from non-Western European, non-Northern European countries, Africa, Asia, more and more from Latin America. And they bring Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam with them. So what's happening? Well, our cultural mosaic, our cultural stew is no longer from that European and specifically that Northern European Christendom. On the one hand, there's that increasing secularization that's pushing civil religion to the side, and particularly the Christian elements of civil religion to the side. But the civil religion is not necessarily dying, it's just becoming more pluralistic in content. And the map continues to change. So we don't talk about Jesus anymore, certainly, but we talk about God, and it becomes whatever you define him to be, but that's our civil religion. Well, what are the benefits and dangers of civil religion? Well, some benefits. Number one, like Christendom, civil religion in our country, American civil religion, served as the glue that held the dominant culture together. Now, there was a dominant culture. Some of you know that. Some of you didn't come out of the dominant culture. There was a dominant culture, still is. And it held a dominant culture together. And if you were an immigrant or you were outside of the dominant culture and you wanted to make it in the American way of life, you had to assimilate to that or at least pretend to. Another thing is that it provided some semblance of common ground to answer questions of authority, morals, and ethics. We had a common morality language. Whether we practiced it or not was another thing. But we had a common moral language. And we had a common language during times of crisis. And the most recent, and it's not even recent anymore, was 9/11. What happened at 9/11? Everybody went where? They went to church. All those people got saved. No, it was we got to get back to where there's a comfort zone and we could talk about God and we could talk about, not a bad thing, hear me well, it's not a bad thing, but it's not necessarily biblical Christianity. And civil religion, interestingly, ironically, kept the extremes from dominating the culture. On one extreme is secularism, did not dominate the culture, although that's changing. But it also kept theocracy, those who wanted theocracy, from dominating the culture. I mean, there is a lot of brilliance into the way our founding fathers set it all up with checks and balances and all that. It kept extremes at each end. It kept that common language. That's changing. Well, some dangers of civil religion, a lot like Christendom, it can confuse Christianity with patriotism, or worse, with nationalism. You ever heard that? Now, the most radical and violent example is the Civil War, the Union and the Confederacy. Both sides were absolutely convinced that they were fighting for a holy and just cause. They can't both be right. Pastors on both sides thank God because he was on their side. And that was, that's the worst example of it. That nationalism, we confuse that. Number two, it actually weakens the gospel of Jesus Christ and the call to discipleship. That civil religion, we basically wind up with a generic God, a generic prayer. We thank God for touchdowns, for Grammys, for Oscars. And we post it on Facebook because we're so excited. Somebody said Jesus during that award presentation. The gospel is not this civil religion. And then also we confuse unbelievers. We confuse unbelievers, especially non-Westerners. I'm driving with a friend of mine who's now in Brooklyn. I'd love to tell you the story. He was a Palestinian terrorist. And he came to Christ. He was led to Christ by Messianic Jews. It's an incredible story. It blows your mind. But anyway, he was in Beirut. I met him in Beirut. He was in Beirut. Hezbollah got his name, got wind of him, had to leave Beirut. So he's in Fort Worth, and now he's in Brooklyn. So he's driving with me as I'm going to go speak at a church. And he starts asking me questions, and he starts getting frustrated because I start telling him about, he's asking about Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and how can you allow mosques to be built in this country, and how can you, and he said, but you're a Christian nation. And I said, Summer, let me explain something to you. He was confused. And once I explained to him that number one, it's called freedom. And number two, we're not a Christian nation as you are thinking. I mean, this is a guy who's a radical disciple of Jesus. He went from being a radical Muslim to a radical Christian. Well, he doesn't carry an AK-47 as a Christian. He carries an M16. No, I'm just kidding. No. Yeah. But it's confusing. Well, you throw into that secularization. We've mentioned that several times. The secularization is the bitter icing in all this hard-to-swallow cake. It's the thread through all that we've been talking about. Now, secularism is that aggressive political movement of philosophy that affirms that the less public religiosity there is, the greater the benefit of society. This is what evangelicals feel and fear the most. Secularism. Hey, you want to be religious? You want to worship God? You want to have faith? Fine, but keep it to yourself. Keep it at the margins. Keep it in the walls of the church, but keep it out of your public life. That's secularism. Secularization is simply the historical process of moving from a biblical worldview to where we are now. Well, interestingly and ironically, most sociologists note, and it blows people's minds sometimes when I say this, America, Christian nation, maybe, all that, but religious. But America we were born as the first modern secular nation. Now, why would that be? Because we were the first nation in history not to have a state church. And that's a secular ideal. So interestingly, right off the bat, from day one, there's the tension. That we are a Judeo-Christian, possibly kind of sort of religious Christian nation, but we're also secular in the sense that we're saying no to 17 years, we're in lecture minus the 300, so 1,400 years of history saying no more church state. No more confusing the two. And that's been a debate and a fight and a controversy ever since. It's a wonderful tension, but it's a very difficult tension. Well, does not mean that this growing secularization does not mean the disappearance of religion. We're still a religious nation, but it means that religion is being relocated to the private sphere of life. Most Americans, your people, we feel growing secularization. Sometimes we can't put our finger on it, but we feel it in large part because of its prevalence in academia, mass media, entertainment world. It's just rampant. We know that. And America seems more secular now and is more secular now than it used to be because the elite are more secular. See, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, if you went and looked at all the presidents of the Ivy League colleges, they were churchmen. They're not now. So the academic elite, the communications and media elite, they have become secularized, so all of that just trickles right down or pours right down or floods right down on us. So that's what your people are feeling on a daily-to-day basis. It doesn't mean that people are any less religious. It's just giving shove to the side. So let's close with this. What are the trends? What's coming to you? What's coming to your community? What's even now right in your congregation? Well, there's questioning, if not outright denial, of ultimate and absolute authority in general, and especially the Bible as the revealed Word of God. If you got millennials, if you work with millennials, you know that's true. Yeah, I believe in God, and I believe in Jesus, and I believe the Bible, but I'm not sure all this stuff it really says about homosexuality is really true. Right? We start getting the yeah buts. Now, that's always been there. It's just now more obvious in that sense. By the way, I had a lady once tell me that they did a biblical worldview survey in her church, and the age group that scored the lowest was the 60 and above. Because all their yeah buts was patriotism and nationalism. They had all the morality stuff right, except for maybe the morality of invading another, well, never mind. So questioning of ultimate and absolute authority, which leads to tolerance for other spiritual paths, religious pluralism, designer spirituality. That postmodern can hold conflicting views. Why? It works. Doesn't matter if it's logical, it works. And also tolerance for designer ethics and morality. I mean, if there are no absolutes and no ultimate authority, then we can make our own morality. And that eventually leads to where we are right now, the demeaning of human life and the culture of death. If there's no absolute authority which speaks to the meaning of life, then Darwinism, evolutionism rules. And eventually that leads to meaninglessness, despair, addiction, all of which we try to fill with stuff, with entertainment, with sex, with food. And I even say that in the Baptist group, with food. The scary part is that so many Christians and so many pastors do the same. And we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. Consequently, holding to biblical truth, holding to biblical practice will lead to marginalization. That's what that book's about. Criticism, ridicule, maybe even persecution. If you hold to the authority of Scripture, if you teach it, you try to practice it, you will be in the minority. And many of you know about that. You're there, you've experienced it, you grew up with it. But it's also going to lead to the shrinking of congregational size, resources, public influence. That's where all those scary stats come from. It's also going to lead to the shrinking of the usual missions outreach fishing pond. We'll talk more about that in session 3, what that fishing pond looks like. But the good news is it's the greatest opportunity in a long time to be salt and light and demonstrate what a committed disciple and a committed community of Christ really looks like. You know, we often talk about, and I've heard it, we pray, we say we don't want to play church, we still don't know how not to play church. We're learning we're going to be forced to not play church. Well, now that we've seen how and why the map has changed, how do we better read the current cultural map so we can draw up a new flight plan to help us and our churches navigate the 21st century? And that'll be session 2. And I've got some questions there for further reflection. I'm kind of one of those reflective. I hope we all are kind of reflective to some degree, but I know plenty of people who aren't. But how can I help? Some questions for further reflection. How can I help my people understand what's happening in the world, our nation, our community, and in the life of the church? What do they need to know, understand, question, affirm, forget, relearn, rethink, set aside? What are some of the comfortable elements of civil religion I see in my community, my church, which may confuse American culture with biblical Christianity? How has civil religion and cultural Christianity affected the message of the gospel in my church? What are some implications for my preaching and teaching, especially on national holidays and election years? And boy, this year, it's great. Because how can I remind my congregation that we're kingdom citizens first, but we can still need to be good American citizens? Now, being that good American citizen part is really hard to figure out right now. I just read today an obituary that was sent from Richmond, Virginia, the obituary of a 68-year-old woman. And the obituary started, faced with the possibility of having to vote for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, she decided to go be with the Lord. That was the actual obituary. It's just my wife sent it to me today. So I don't know if she decided that or her kids or whatever, but they have a sense of humor. Anyway, how can I lead my church to think first of the kingdom, and that church is a kingdom outpost? What are the implications in and for a flat, globalized world? What are some aspects of secularized society, individualism, consumerism, religious compartmentalization I've seen accepted by people in my church? How have I seen secularization creeping into my community and even into my church? And then I got some suggested resources for you there. And appreciate the opportunity to start this, and we'll pick up again tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.